Since the 2008 global financial crisis, private lives of millions of people around the world have been turned upside down. It has just been terrible for so many. The business world was terribly shaken. People reacted. Protesters stormed the streets. People were upset with the greediness that they seemed to be taking place everywhere. Some who could only see a tunnel at the end took their own lives. Families were disrupted. Some marriages actually ended. In this presentation, we're going to briefly explore some issues that we as Christians need to consider at times like this. It comes to our personal and business ethics, issues that we need to address on a more practical level. We maintain that there should be no difference between our personal ethics and our business ethics. Ethics, you see, is about moral principles that govern a person or a group's behavior. So we felt that it was important for us to include this in a stewardship series because faithfulness to God is about how we relate to others, about how we relate to the integrity issues that face every Christian. The experience of God's people recorded in the book of Judges reveals how they exchanged one kind of slavery for a whole different kind, but it was still slavery. It had to do a lot with their own personal ethics. The reason for this time of uncertainty and chaos, as we find in Judges chapter 2, verses 16 and 17. Then the Lord raised up the judges who saved them out of the hands of the raiders. Now notice this, verse 17. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshiped them. Unlike their fathers, they quickly turned from the way in which their fathers had walked and the obedience of the Lord's commands. What in the world would have caused a blessed people to forget what had brought them through such difficulties in the past? Over and over again, we find in the book of Judges a theme that's summarized this way. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. And this is happening today as well. Others concluded that if some are doing it, then it's all right to do it as well. Corruption spreads that way. Unfortunately, God's people were influenced by their own surroundings, and they became like those around them. Such attitudes and practices of compromise hurt the very mission of God. Investigations during this global financial crisis revealed the unethical and self-centered practices which grew and grew, starting out small, but they grew and grew. Eventually, Wall Street and many world economies adopted a compromised standard of values. Self-centeredness became the rule, and the problem grew. Then the bottom dropped out. Some companies simply did not survive. Many innocent people lost jobs and homes. Even marriages collapsed. Greed and self-centeredness can easily spread, and many were hurt. During this time, I read a book by a man by the name of D. Hock, the founder of the Visa credit card. He identifies 4 factors that cause businesses to self-destruct. He refers to them as 4 beasts, and I thought that sounded pretty Adventist. 4 beasts that inevitably devour businesses. Hawk was in the heart of the business world. He experienced what he was talking about. He saw these 4 beast factors destroy otherwise good companies, and I share them with you because I think we can learn from them as well. In his book, The Birth of the Chaotic Age, chaotic meaning order and chaos being combined at the same time. These beasts are 4 points. 1, ego. 2, envy. 3, avarice or greed for wealth. And 4 was ambition. Let's take a quick look at these so that we can begin to see the impact that they could have on us individually as well as the church. The first one is ego. Ego is a sense of self-importance, or it can be at least in its negative form. Notice how Ellen White speaks about it in the book Christian Service. Man longs to rule over his fellow men, separating himself in his egotism from God and his fellow beings. He follows his unrestrained inclinations. He acts as if the good of others depended on their subjection to his supremacy. Now, there's a good illustration of egotism. The second beast that D. Hawk talks about is that of envy, or the desire for a longing for the possessions and the qualities of others. It may not just be their possessions, but I'm envious of their particular talents or their abilities. In the book of Patriarchs and Prophets, envy is the offspring of pride. And if it is entertained in the heart, it will lead to hatred and eventually to revenge. And she goes one more step, and even to murder. And of course, in our minds, we think about the story of Cain and Abel. The third beast that Hawk identifies is that of avarice, extreme greed for wealth or material gain. And we find the following lesson described from the experience of Judas when she talks about this. His mind had become debased by covetousness, and a man who was enslaved by avarice, this greed for wealth or fame, is in danger of going to any lengths of crime. The fourth beast that he talks about is ambition, which is an ardent desire for rank, fame, or power. Notice what is said here, how she describes this. Through the temptation to self-indulgence and ambition, Satan accomplished the fall of our first parents. And from that time to the present, the gratification of human ambition and the indulgence of selfish hopes and desires have proved to be the ruin of mankind. The religious world is not immune to these kinds of problems. We talk about them in the corporate world, but let me assure you, they can be found in religious institutions and in religious communities as well. Seldom do individuals start out with the idea of being unethical, but it grows and it develops. The investigators of the recent financial crisis have identified 7 signs of ethical or moral behavior that leads to a collapse. And I think it would be well for us to share those 7 signs with you. We'll have to do it very quickly, so please take note. But first of all, a statement by Ellen White in which she found herself in a situation, and she speaks about these issues. This is found in the book Counsels on Stewardship, page 235. Many times when the Lord has opened the way for brethren to handle their means to advance his cause, the agents of Satan have presented some enterprise by which they were positive the brethren could double their means. They take the bait. Their money is invested, and the cause and frequently themselves never receive a dollar. Just this week, I received an email from a friend who was suggesting that the General Conference ought to invest their money over here and they would make more money. We need to be careful. Good counsel is always welcome, but we do need to be careful. There's something about the excitement that accompanies speculation that is contagious. Financial pyramid schemes, for example, that's just one example. But not all dangers are limited to speculation. Marianne Jennings, professor of business ethics at the Arizona State University, has written a book called The 7 Signs of Ethical Collapse: How to Spot Moral Meltdown in Companies. She was able to do this with several companies, including Enron and the dot-coms. She saw the signs of a moral collapse. Let me share with you those 7 signs that would be helpful for us to keep in mind. The first one is the pressure to maintain numbers. This is not just a focus on numbers and results. That in itself isn't bad. But an unreasonable and unrealistic obsession with meeting quantitative goals can lead to a fall. So, number one, a pressure to maintain those numbers. A second sign is the fear of silence, fear and silence. In other words, I'm afraid to speak up because someone would disapprove of what I'm saying. And so the very insight that is needed can be held off and not heard. Sometimes this is done just the opposite. Instead of pointing out the problems, we will flatter the person who is making decisions. Bad news is avoided at any cost. The third sign is a domineering, charismatic leader is surrounded by those who are inexperienced. In other words, a very domineering or charismatic leader begins to surround himself or herself with those who are inexperienced so that his or her ideas can be pushed forward. This is certainly a danger, and the person becomes a symbol of success, and therefore no one dares speak against it. Point number 4 is also important, and that is we can find ourselves with a very weak board. Churches can do this, institutions can do this. These boards are populated oftentimes by friends of the management team. They would never speak up against a friend. They can be overly influenced by this leader. And so having a weak board often is best counteracted by a new board or bringing in members who see things differently and who are constructive in their criticism. Sign number 5 is a conflict of interest. When this happens, we begin to find that personal interests of one person is put aside so that the family can be benefited, for example, the family or other associates. Again, what we find happening over and over again is that the very issues that need to be addressed are not addressed in order to benefit the welfare of other people or the personal interest. It can be financial, or it can be positions, whatever the case may be. Conflicts of interest is something that we take very seriously. Sign number 6 that can stand in the way of a healthy organization is the innovation like no others. In this case, we find amazing innovations or creativity. I've seen this happen. We value creativity. The great ideas are important, but sometimes they can undermine the very strength of an organization. We become overconfident about the law of economics, and we know that we can override them. Tremendous success is often seen initially, but doesn't always last. Sign number 7, goodness in some areas atones for evil in other areas. The idea here is that if we can just direct the attention away from what we're doing over here and show what is good on this side, then perhaps the bad won't be seen. And this is what was happening during the global crisis. Good companies were making some unfortunate decisions, and to direct the attention of the shareholders, they began to show what good things they were doing. Jennings says, beware of that. Be careful. Investigate the compassionate activities. Not that all compassionate activities are a cover-up, but sometimes they are a means of diverting the attention away from what we need to do. So we have 7 signs that we would like to draw your attention to, because each one of these can direct our energies and associations away from what really needs to be done. Let me mention those 7 signs again. Pressure to maintain numbers. 2, be silent. Fear creates silence so that the real issues are not addressed. Number 3, a domineering or charismatic leader may sometimes surround themselves by those who are not experienced. We know that the danger of insulating criticism can silence the very insights that are needed. Number 4 is a weak board. We need to make it easier for board members to speak up so that they can speak to the issues. A strong board is not a yes board, but nevertheless, how we express our criticism or our suggestions is also very important. Number 5, we talk about conflicts of interest. The weakness here is when an organization is family friendly, for example. The benefit is for themselves rather than the organization. Point number 6 is the value placed more on creativity than the wealth or the health of the organization. And then number 7, goodness in some areas atones for evil in other areas. These 7 points need to be kept in the front. There are 7 safeguards that we could talk about too, but being aware of the dangers is certainly important. As we look for creating a healthy organization, we need to make sure that we stay close to the ethical principles that God has given to us. Welcome back, and we have with me today 2 good friends, Willie, who will be working with us, and James. And we have some questions that are before us that we would like to share with you. The first question, James, I'll ask you.
Okay.
If we see the leaders in our church making poor ethical decisions, how do we get them to change?
That's a very good question. And the Bible provides us with the steps that we can take. Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 through 17 says that you go to the individual. If the individual won't hear you, you take 2 others with you. If the leader still won't hear, then you talk with your church board.
Well,
If they want to listen to your church board, take it to your conference.
I thought what we did was we hold back our tithe and make sure that they understand that they need to change.
That is not the biblical method.
That's not.
No,
Yeah.
Why?
No.
because you'll be holding what belongs to God
So the tithe-
as ransom.
Ah.
That becomes ransom money.
Okay, so now what you're telling me is that tithe belongs to God,
It belongs to God.
not for them to even withhold.
Oh no.
Ah,
Okay.
good point. Willie, I have a question for you. One of the signs that we've talked about is that there's a need to maintain numbers. We've got to grow. We've got to see the quantity increase.
Right. Yes.
So the church counts. Is it wrong to have baptisms and to count the baptisms?
Well, I believe that it is not wrong to count baptisms because we grow, and in order for us to know that we're growing, of course, we need to see that the numbers also grow. However, there's a however here. And that is when our focus is on number rather than the conversion itself that happens in the individual. I have known of several evangelists who just baptize and baptize because of statistics. But, after some time, maybe months later, we find that these people are no longer in church.
But what you're saying is that the number here in this case isn't the problem. I mean, after all, you read the book of Acts and you find the numbers are there.
Yes, thousands.
But the bigger point is that we have the kingdom of God at hand. And we don't compromise our ethics to do that.
I think that's the point.
All right.
Yes.
Good.
I'd like to add,
Please.
every action is judged by the motive that prompted it.
Thank you.
So the question is, why are you counting?
Yeah.
Yes, in Acts chapter 2, verse 41, it tells us that more than 3,000 persons became members of the Church of the Living God.
And we know from the Old Testament where the census was taken for the wrong reason.
There's a book of Numbers.
That's right. That's right. All right. Question number 3 that's come in. You guys get to decide which one you
Okay.
get to speak to this. What if what is right in my eyes is really the right thing? What if I am the only one who sees it and nobody else sees it my way and I know that this is the right thing? What should I do?
Well, I think I have to persuade other people that what I know is right is really right. But of course, we have to beware because the Bible says there is a way that is right in the eyes of men, but the end thereof is the way of death.
And this is interesting because you're an attorney.
Okay.
And you used to arguing with people to persuade.
That's right. You must have evidence
Must have evidence.
in order to show that you are right.
Okay.
The evidence is the law. The evidence is the Bible. And if you are persuasive enough, then people will see that what you think is right, that they did not think so, they will be convinced.
All right.
In Judges chapter 17 and chapter 17 and chapter 21, it says, when there was no king in Israel, every man did what was right in his own eyes.
Okay.
When there was no king, when there was no leader.
Yeah. All the way through Judges, you find that phrase over. They did what was right in their own eyes.
So consult.
Let me ask you this real quick. We have 32 seconds. What's wrong with ambition? Or is there anything wrong?
Well, ambition is a good thing because it is comparable to something that propels you up to accomplish something. But I think there is also wrong in ambition. Ambition per se is not wrong, but the motive, again, behind our ambition, especially if it stands on the way of that which is very important, that's when it becomes wrong.
Thank you. Thank you, man. You've got great insights. I do appreciate it. You know, we've covered a lot of ground in a very short time. There's so much more that needs to be said when it comes to ethics, good behavior, integrity in an organization, integrity in the leadership, integrity in the membership of our church. We began by talking about the time of Judges. when it seemed that each did what was right in their own eyes. Such a course not only added confusion, but it added serious compromises which ended up hindering the cause of God. We talked about ego, envy, avarice, ambition. And they all can bring any of us down. Doesn't matter how big, how small, what position we have, these qualities can all bring us down to the place where our integrity is sacrificed. But before we close, I want to challenge you. I won't list all the 7 signs, but I want to challenge you with some principles that are questions that have come to me over the years as I've worked in stewardship. Questions about, so let me ask you, points of signs of concern, at least, were brought to me. Reporting dishonest expenses, travel expenses, office expenses. I worked with a president who greatly inspired me. Oh, I'll mention his name, Elder Don Snyder. He would tell me, Larry, you know, I put aside money every year just in case I took paper clips or used paper clips. He called it his paperclip fund at the end of the year, and I follow the same practice. At the end of the year, I just give a special gift to make sure that everything is totally right. Another question was requesting subsidies for exaggerated project expenses. We report more than actually was spent, or accepting bribes of money, honorariums. In order to do our job, we have to be paid extra. Submitting false or exaggerated insurance claims, buying into the old adage that says, everyone else is doing it, why can't I do it? Or dishonesty when filling out tax forms. When tax season comes, boy, do we fudge there? You see, integrity within the church isn't always what it should be. It's not always easy, but we need to understand that we have this big challenge. I'd like to close with two Bible verses that are so important. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Galatians 2:20. And then finally, the golden rule, so in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. So be it. Let our ethics be the golden rule.
Look, Daddy. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Everything we own is a blessing from God. All of it belongs to Him. God only requires 1/10 to be returned to Him as an act of worship and an expression of our faithfulness to Him. Tithe is God's money. And in tithing, we're simply returning to the owner what rightly belongs to Him. And as we faithfully return 1/10 of our income, we will continue to provide for us according to His promises. Tithing is one of the most tangible ways to experience God. It's a most rewarding step of faith and a wonderful testimony of our faith. Take that step of faith today and experience God's faithfulness.
This one's for Jesus.
Remember, stewardship is my all in response to God's all.